The Winchester rifle gleamed in Margaret O'Sullivan's steady hands. She stepped onto the saloon's weathered porch, the desert night cold against her skin. Below in the alley, three drunk cowboys had cornered young Sarah Mitchell. Their laughter was sharp, ugly, like broken glass grinding in the dirt. But it wasn't the gun that made them freeze. It was the man standing between them and the trembling girl. Reverend Miller's son, Jonathan, his white collar torn, a thin line of blood trickling from his split lip. "Step away from her!" Jonathan Miller's voice was nothing like the one he used for Sunday sermons. This was raw, dangerous. The largest cowboy, a brute named Crane with a tobacco-stained beard, spat a dark stream of juice near Jonathan's feet and sneered. "Well, well, look what we got here. The preacher's boy playing hero." His hand drifted toward the Colt Peacemaker, strapped to his hip. "Maybe it's time someone taught you about the real world, Bible boy." Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. In Cedar Ridge, Arizona, 1885, a man could die for far less than what these drifters were planning. And despite everything the town whispered about her, the scandalized looks, the hushed conversations that died the moment she walked past, she wasn't about to let them kill the only man who'd ever looked at her like she was worth saving. "What happens next?" she called out, her Irish accent cutting through the tension like a blade. "Depends on whether you boys are as stupid as you look." The question hung in the dry desert air, thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. It wasn't about whether blood would be spilled. It was about whose blood it would be. And in that moment, watching Jonathan Miller stand his ground against impossible odds, Margaret O'Sullivan realized she'd already made her choice. But this night, this bloody confrontation, it wasn't the beginning of their story. It was the beginning of the end. To understand how they got here, we have to go back 3 months. Back to a time when Cedar Ridge was nothing more than a way station where hope went to die. 3 months earlier, the drought had lasted 18 agonizing months. The land was cracked and broken, like God's own shattered heart. But it's in the broken places that the most unexpected things take root. Jonathan Miller was walking through the market square, his arms piled high with supplies for the church. Flour for communion bread, oil for the lamps, a bottle of laudanum for old Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism. He was a man on a predictable path, his life laid out like the straight, dusty road that led into town, until he rounded the corner of Peterson's general store. Margaret O'Sullivan was backing out of the doorway, a heavy crate of whiskey bottles in her arms. The collision was inevitable, a symphony of shattering glass. Amber liquid pooled in the dust, the sharp smell of spirits mixing with the dry earth. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, the preacher's son and the saloon keeper's widow, surrounded by the wreckage of propriety. "I'm terribly sorry," Jonathan stammered, dropping to his knees to help gather the few unbroken bottles. His eyes met hers for the first time, and something electric, something dangerous passed between them. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a fierce intelligence in those green eyes, and something else he couldn't quite name, a deep, familiar loneliness. "No harm done," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the soft lilt of County Cork. "Though I suppose this is what they call an omen." She accepted his hand as he helped her to her feet, her fingers lingering against his palm for just a moment too long. And that's when he saw it. Hidden beneath the remaining bottles was another world entirely. Small, carefully wrapped packages of medicine, tinned food, a pair of children's shoes, so small they could have belonged to a doll. While he'd been collecting supplies for God's house, she'd been gathering provisions for God's forgotten children. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, finally recognizing her from the pointed whispers that followed her through town like a ghost. I didn't realize you were—" "What?" Her smile was as sharp as a winter wind. "Taking care of the Murphy children since their father broke his leg in the mine? Or buying medicine for the Petersons' baby? Careful, Mr. Miller. People might think you actually see me as a human being." Before he could respond, she was gone, walking away with a sway in her hips that was both defiant and graceful. But she'd left something behind. A small package of fever medicine had rolled under the store's steps. When Jonathan picked it up, he saw the name written in her careful script. Tommy Morrison, age 6. The Morrison family lived in a shanty on the edge of town, a place the respectable folk of Cedar Ridge tried to forget existed. That night, as he delivered the medicine himself, pretending he'd bought it for the church's charity fund, Jonathan Miller began to understand a terrifying truth. Everything he'd been told about Margaret O'Sullivan was a lie. And more dangerously, everything he'd been told about himself might be a lie too. The real question wasn't whether she was the temptation his father claimed she was. The real question was whether he was brave enough to find out what kind of man he was, beneath the collar and the crushing weight of expectation. He had no idea that finding out would cost him everything. The drought broke 2 weeks later, but the rains didn't bring relief. They brought trouble. Miners, flushed with silver and starved for release after months of backbreaking labor, flooded into Cedar Ridge. The Broken Wheel Saloon, Margaret's inheritance from her late husband, became the eye of every storm. And it was on one of those rain-soaked evenings that Jonathan witnessed the ugly truth the respectable folk of Cedar Ridge preferred to ignore. He was walking home from visiting a sick parishioner when he heard a girl's frightened cry from the alley behind the church. He found them there. 3 miners, their faces slick with rain and whiskey, had cornered 15-year-old Sarah Mitchell. Their intentions were as clear as the terror in her eyes. They reeked of sweat and cheap liquor, their hands already reaching for what they thought was theirs to take. Jonathan didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He simply acted, stepping out of the shadows with nothing but righteous anger and a silent prayer on his lips. Let her go! The miners turned, their faces twisting with cruel amusement. The leader, William Crane, the same man he would face 3 months later, looked him up and down. Well, look here, Crane drawled, his beard stained with tobacco. The holy man wants to play. What happened next shattered every illusion Jonathan had about his own strength. The first punch sent him sprawling into the mud, the world exploding in a flash of white pain. The second brought the coppery taste of blood to his mouth. He was on his knees, arms wrapped protectively around his head as boots slammed into his ribs, each impact stealing his breath. He was about to lose consciousness when the distinctive click-clack of a Winchester rifle being cocked cut through the sound of the rain and his own ragged gasps. Gentlemen! Margaret's voice carried the kind of cold, hard authority that came from running a business where weakness was a death sentence. She stood at the mouth of the alley, rain plastering her auburn hair to her neck, the rifle held as steady as a rock in her hands. I believe the young lady would prefer your company elsewhere. The miners froze, looking from the gun to the woman holding it, their drunken brains slowly calculating the odds. Margaret settled the question for them. She didn't aim at them. She aimed at the wooden fence post just 6 inches from Crane's head. The rifle cracked, and a chunk of wood exploded into the night. Next one goes between your eyes, William Crane, she said, and Jonathan was stunned that she knew the man's name. Your choice. They left. They scrambled away like the rats they were, muttering curses and threats, but they left. Sarah Mitchell ran home to her family, tears of relief streaming down her face, and Jonathan Miller found himself alone in the rain with the woman his father called the devil's own temptation. You could have been killed, Margaret said, helping him to his feet. Her touch was gentle, surprisingly professional, as she checked his injuries with the practiced ease of someone who'd tended more than her share of wounds. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, Jonathan admitted, wincing as she examined his split lip. But I couldn't just watch. Something shifted in her expression then. Surprise, maybe, or respect. Come on, she said, her voice softening. Let's get you cleaned up before your congregation sees their shepherd looking like he lost a fight with a pack of wolves. He followed her, not to the front door of the saloon, but to a private entrance at the side. The interior of the Broken Wheel was nothing like he had imagined. Yes, there were the poker tables and the long bar lined with bottles of every shape and color. But there were also shelves filled with books, curtains on the windows, and a small, quiet area in the back where children's primers sat next to slate boards. It wasn't just a den of vice, it was a home. You teach them, he said, his voice filled with a wonder that surprised even himself. Someone has to, Margaret replied, pouring warm water into a basin. The territorial government promised a school teacher 2 years ago. We're still waiting. She dabbed at the cut on his cheek with a clean cloth, her touch sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the pain. Her fingers were strong, capable, yet her movements were filled with a surprising gentleness. "Here," she said, pushing a steaming mug into his hand. "Drink." "I don't—" "It's coffee," she clarified, a flicker of amusement dancing in her green eyes. "Though Lord knows, after tonight, you might want something stronger." As she tended his wounds, she talked. She told him about her late husband, Patrick, a man who had dreamed of striking it rich in the mines, but found only an early grave in a collapse 18 months ago. She spoke of inheriting a business she'd never wanted, but learning to run it with an iron fist because the alternative was starvation or worse. She talked about the crushing loneliness of being the town pariah, respected for her strength, but feared for her independence. "People need someone to blame for their own weakness," she said, her voice low as she cleaned the blood from his knuckles. "It's easier than looking at themselves in the mirror." "Is that why you stay?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "To give them someone to blame?" Margaret paused, her eyes meeting his in the warm lamplight. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken things. "I stay because this is my home now," she said softly, "and because sometimes someone needs to stand between the wolves and the sheep." She offered a small, sad smile, even if the sheep don't always appreciate it. When he finally left that night, walking through the muddy streets toward the cold, empty parsonage, Jonathan Miller carried more than just bruises. He carried the ghost of Margaret O'Sullivan's hands on his skin, the echo of her laughter, and the dangerous, liberating knowledge that everything he'd been taught about sin and salvation was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Behind him, a single light still flickered in the saloon window. He couldn't know it then, but she was watching him go, her hand pressed against the cold glass, already wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The secret meetings began innocently enough, or so they told themselves. Margaret had mentioned needing help with the children's lessons, particularly with reading, and Jonathan, the educated preacher's son, found himself offering his services. It was godly work after all. Who could argue with that? The fact that it meant spending quiet evenings in Margaret's presence was, he assured himself, merely a coincidence. 3 nights a week, after the last drunk had been escorted from the broken wheel and the doors were bolted shut, Jonathan would slip through the side entrance. In these quiet hours, the saloon transformed. The tables were pushed aside to make a small classroom, and the rough laughter of miners was replaced by the soft, eager voices of children. Margaret, he discovered, was a gifted teacher. She was patient with the slow learners, endlessly encouraging with the bright ones. "Reading opens doors," she told 10-year-old Jaime Peterson, her finger guiding his along the words in a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. "Every book is a new world, Jaime, a new world waiting just for you to explore." Jonathan watched her from across the room, ostensibly helping little Maria Santos with her arithmetic, but his attention kept drifting. He found himself mesmerized by the way the lamplight caught the copper threads in her hair, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over a child's slate, the unconscious grace with which she moved. Every gesture spoke of a strength tempered by a compassion the rest of Cedar Ridge refused to see. "Mr. Miller?" Maria tugged at his sleeve, her young face serious. "You're staring again." Heat flooded Jonathan's face. He felt like a schoolboy caught daydreaming. "I was just observing teaching methods, Maria." Margaret glanced up, catching his embarrassment, and a smile bloomed on her face. It was a different smile than the sharp, defensive one she wore for the world. This one was warm, intimate, and it felt like it was meant only for him, a secret they shared in the flickering light. After the children had been sent home with their books and slates, they would sit by the dying fire talking. They talked about everything and nothing. Margaret told him stories of her childhood in Ireland, of the great hunger that had driven her family to America in search of a dream. She spoke of the dreams she'd once harbored, dreams of a different life, before the harsh realities of the frontier had taught her that survival mattered more than hope. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted one night, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear. Her fingers traced patterns on the scarred wooden table between them. "A proper one, in a real school with brick walls and a bell tower. Foolish, perhaps." "Not foolish," Jonathan said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Beautiful." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Margaret's eyes met his, and for a long moment, the careful distance they had maintained threatened to collapse entirely. The space between them crackled with tension. "Jonathan," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like both a prayer and a curse. He couldn't stop himself. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm, calloused from hard work, but soft in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. "Margaret, this is dangerous," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but she didn't pull her hand away. "For both of us." "I know." His thumb traced the line of her knuckles, marveling at the way such a simple touch could set his entire body on fire. He was a man who had preached about the fires of hell, but he had never understood the fires of temptation until this moment. "I know what they'll say, what he'll say." They both knew who he was, Reverend Samuel Miller. His father's disapproval had been a cold shadow growing longer each week. His sermons had become more pointed, filled with dark warnings about temptation, moral weakness, and the vipers hiding in their midst. The congregation had begun to notice Jonathan's distraction, his father's increasing agitation. The whispers were getting louder. "He loves you," Margaret said softly, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. "He's afraid of losing you to a woman like me." "And I," Jonathan confessed, his gaze locked on hers, "I'm afraid of losing myself if I don't." He let the sentence trail off, unwilling to voice the truth they both understood. He was falling in love with her. And in a town like Cedar Ridge, that love was a spark in a powder keg. That night, as he walked home through the empty moonlit streets, Jonathan Miller made a choice that would change everything. He would no longer hide what he felt. He would no longer live in fear of the whispers or the judgment. He had found something real, something true in the back room of a saloon, and he would not let it go. The only question left was whether Cedar Ridge and his own father could survive the truth. Behind him in the saloon window, a lone silhouette watched him disappear into the darkness, her hand pressed against the glass like a farewell or a warning. The confrontation came on a Sunday morning. It came in the sacred space where Jonathan had spent his entire life learning about grace and forgiveness, only to find there was none to be had. Reverend Samuel Miller stood before his congregation, his weathered hands gripping the pulpit like he was trying to choke the life out of the wood itself. His eyes, cold and hard as river stones, found his son in the front pew. "There are wolves among us," he declared, his voice booming with the weight of Old Testament authority. "Wolves in sheep's clothing, leading the righteous astray with false promises and sinful temptations." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming. He'd seen it building for weeks in his father's increasingly pointed remarks, his dark glances, the suffocating disapproval that filled the parsonage. "The Lord commands us to be separate from the world," Samuel continued, his gaze never leaving his son's face. It felt less like a sermon and more like a public execution. "To avoid even the appearance of evil, there are those among us who would compromise our principles, who would drag us down into the mire of sin and degradation for their own selfish pleasure." In the third row, Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly, her fan snapping shut with a sharp crack. Mayor Whitman's wife whispered something to her neighbor, and both women shot venomous glances toward the back of the church. Jonathan's head snapped around, and his heart stopped. Margaret was there. She sat alone in the very last pew, an island in a sea of hostility. She had come to church. Despite everything, despite the whispers and the judgment, she had put on her best dress, a simple dark blue that made her auburn hair seem to burn, and walked into the very heart of the community that scorned her. Her chin was raised, her green eyes defiant, but Jonathan could see the cost of her courage in the tight, white-knuckled grip she had on her worn hymnal. "Some may ask," Samuel's voice rose to a crescendo, dripping with righteous fury, "why we allow such corruption to exist in our midst, why we permit establishments of vice and immorality to flourish while godly folks struggle to raise their children in righteousness." The temperature in the small church seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every single eye in the congregation turned toward Margaret. The collective judgment was a physical thing, palpable as smoke, pressing down on her. Jonathan watched her hands clench in her lap. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes the moment when her proud defiance began to crack under the weight of their hatred. And he stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the wooden floor echoed in the sudden, shocking silence. His father paused mid-sentence, pure shock replacing the anger on his weathered face. "If I may, Father," Jonathan said, his voice miraculously steady despite the tremor that ran through his hands. "I'd like to share something with the congregation." Samuel's eyes flashed a silent, furious warning, but the entire town was watching. He had no choice. He stepped aside. Jonathan walked to the pulpit, acutely aware that every person in Cedar Ridge was holding their breath, waiting to see the preacher's son finally denounce the woman who had led him astray. Instead, he turned and looked directly at Margaret, drawing strength from the flicker of hope he saw in her eyes. "I've learned something these past few months," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I've learned that grace isn't something we earn through perfect behavior or spotless reputations. It's something we give and something we receive, and it often comes from the most unexpected sources." Mrs. Henderson let out an audible gasp. "I have seen a woman," he continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "feed hungry children with her own money while so-called respectable folk cross the street to avoid them. I have seen her teach reading and arithmetic to youngsters the territorial government has forgotten exist. I have seen her stand between danger and innocence, asking for nothing in return but the basic human decency she is so often denied." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she held his gaze, her chin high. "And I have learned," Jonathan concluded, his voice rising to fill every corner of the silent church, "that sometimes the person everyone calls a sinner is doing more of God's work than the person everyone calls a saint." The silence that followed was deafening, absolute. It was broken by Mayor Whitman clearing his throat. The politician in him sensed a shift in the wind. "Well said, Jonathan," he declared, beginning a slow, deliberate clap. "Well said indeed." Others joined in, not everyone, but enough. Mrs. Peterson, whose children Margaret taught. Jim Collins, the blacksmith, whose broken arm Margaret had helped set when the doctor was out of town. And near the back, Sarah Mitchell's parents, who knew exactly who had saved their daughter from a fate worse than death. A quiet revolution was happening in the pews of the Cedar Ridge Church, but not Samuel Miller. The Reverend stood frozen at the side of the pulpit, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal, watching as his son dismantled the world he had so carefully constructed. After the service, as the congregation filed out in excited, buzzing clusters of conversation, Jonathan approached his father. Samuel's face was pale, ashen. He looked like he had aged a decade in the space of 20 minutes. "You've made your choice," the older man said, his voice hollow. "I pray to God it doesn't damn you both." "And I pray," Jonathan replied, his heart aching, "that you'll find it in your heart to trust the son you raised to know right from wrong." Outside, Margaret waited by the church steps, her posture uncertain for the first time since he'd known her. When she saw him, a wave of relief washed over her features. "That was either very brave," she said, her voice soft, echoing her words from that night in the rain, "or very, very stupid." Jonathan took her gloved hand in his, right there in the sunlight, no longer caring who saw. "Definitely both," he said, a smile finally breaking through. And as he squeezed her hand, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had chosen his side. But he had no idea the war was just beginning. The retaliation came 3 nights later. It came swift and brutal as a desert storm. Jonathan was in his study, trying to prepare a sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan, a topic that now felt deeply, dangerously personal, when the sound of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet. He looked through his window and saw it, a horrifying, dancing orange glow against the night sky. The flames were rising from the direction of the Broken Wheel Saloon. He ran. He ran through the empty streets, his heart hammering against his ribs, a single terrifying word pounding in his brain. Margaret. By the time he reached the saloon, half the town had gathered. It was a grotesque spectacle. Some people held buckets, their faces etched with concern. But others had brought chairs, as if settling in for a Saturday night show. The fire was a judgment, and they were the jury. "Where is she?" Jonathan yelled, grabbing Jim Collins by the arm. "Jim, where's Margaret?" "Inside, far as anyone knows," Collins replied, his face grim. "Front door's barred from the outside. Someone doesn't want her getting out." The crowd parted as Jonathan pushed through, his eyes scanning the jeering, mesmerized faces until he found them. Three miners from the Copper King mine, the same three, and their leader, William Crane, stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied, cruel smirk playing across his tobacco-stained lips. "Shame about the fire," Crane said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Of course, some folks might say it's divine justice. The Lord works in mysterious ways, don't he, preacher boy?" Jonathan didn't waste a single breath on words. He lunged forward, his fist connected with Crane's jaw with a sickening, satisfying crack, sending the larger man sprawling into the dust. The crowd gasped. Jonathan Miller, the gentle preacher's son, throwing punches like a common brawler. "Jonathan!" Margaret's voice came from inside the burning building, muffled by smoke and terror. "The bar! I can't move it!" While Crane's men scrambled to help their leader, Jonathan threw his shoulder against the heavy timber that had been wedged across the front entrance. The wood was new, strong, chosen specifically for this purpose. Smoke, thick and black, poured from beneath the door. He could hear Margaret coughing, her breath growing more ragged. "Help me!" he roared at the crowd, his voice raw with desperation. "For God's sake, help me!" A few people moved forward. Jim Collins, Mayor Whitman looking nervous, but more hung back, their faces a mixture of fear and uncertainty, silently weighing whether saving Margaret O'Sullivan was worth defying whoever had orchestrated this night's work. That's when the sharp crack of a Winchester echoed from behind them. The crowd flinched and turned as one. Reverend Samuel Miller stood at the edge of the square, his old hunting rifle trained squarely on William Crane and his companions. The old man's hands shook slightly, but his voice was as steady and unyielding as the Rock of Ages. "Step away from my son," Samuel commanded. "All of you, step away now." Crane spat a mouthful of blood and dirt, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. Samuel's rifle barrel swung toward him with practiced, deadly precision. "I was killing men when you were still suckling at your mother's teat, boy," Samuel said, his voice quiet, but carrying a chilling finality. "Try me." At that moment, the bar across the door finally gave way with a splintering crash. Margaret stumbled out, her dress torn, her face streaked with soot, coughing and choking, but blessedly, miraculously alive. Jonathan caught her in his arms, holding her tight, feeling her body shake uncontrollably against his chest. "It's all right," he whispered into her hair, burying his face against her neck. "You're safe now. You're safe." But even as he held her, even as he felt the solid, living warmth of her in his arms, Jonathan knew nothing would ever be all right again. Lines had been crossed. Choices had been made that could never be unmade. Cedar Ridge had been forced to show its true face, and it was uglier than he had ever imagined. Crane and his men vanished into the darkness, their leader's threats carried away on the desert wind. The fire was eventually contained, but the damage was done. Not just to the building, but to the very soul of the town. Margaret, leaning heavily on Jonathan, looked over at his father. "Thank you," she whispered to Samuel Miller, who still stood guard with his rifle. The old preacher's eyes were filled with a profound sadness, but his voice was resolved. "Don't thank me yet, daughter," he replied, and the word daughter hung in the smoky air, a shocking, unexpected admission. "The real fight hasn't even started." Dawn came slowly to Cedar Ridge, painting the scorched desert in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both endings and new beginnings. Jonathan sat on the charred steps of what was left of the saloon. Margaret was beside him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, both of them watching the sun climb over the distant mountains. The night had changed everything, and yet nothing at all. The broken will could be repaired. The deeper wounds, the ones carved into the heart of the community, would take much longer to heal. "Your father surprised me," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from the smoke and exhaustion. "He surprised himself, I think," Jonathan replied. He thought of the man who had condemned him from the pulpit and the man who had saved him with a rifle, and realized they were one and the same. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are. Samuel Miller had returned to the parsonage after the fire, his rifle put away, his duty done. But Jonathan knew the old man was struggling, caught between the rigid beliefs that had sustained him for decades and the undeniable, terrifying truth that grace sometimes wore the face of a sinner. "The town council will meet today," Margaret continued, her voice flat. "There will be talk of closing the saloon for good, of driving out the undesirable elements." She gave a wry, humorless smile. "Meaning me?" She turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his. "And what will you do, Jonathan?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. "I've been thinking about what you said in church, about grace, about finding it in unexpected sources." She turned to face him fully, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. Her expression was serious, her eyes burning with a fierce new light. "What if we gave them something truly unexpected?" "What do you mean?" "Marry me, Jonathan Miller." The words hung in the cool desert air between them. Simple and complicated, impossible and inevitable. Jonathan stared at her, his mind reeling. He saw not just the woman he had fallen hopelessly in love with, but a path forward, a future that neither of them had dared to imagine until this very moment. "Margaret," he started, the protest dying on his lips. "I know what it would cost you," she said quickly, cutting him off. "Your position in the church, your reputation, maybe even your relationship with your father. But I also know what we could build together. Right here from these ashes. A real school for the children. A place where grace isn't just preached on Sundays, but practiced every single day. A home." Jonathan thought of his father's rifle, steady in defense of what was right, not just what was written. He thought of the faces in the crowd who had stepped forward to help when it mattered most. He thought of the children who came to Margaret's backroom school because they had nowhere else to turn. He looked at the ruins around them, and for the first time he didn't see destruction. He saw a foundation. "The church will never accept you as a minister's wife," he said, the words a statement of fact, not an objection. Margaret's smile was brilliant, defiant, and full of hope. "Then maybe," she said, taking his hand in hers, "it's time for a different kind of ministry." They were married 3 weeks later. Judge Harrison rode in from Tucson for the occasion. The ceremony didn't take place in the church. Samuel Miller had made it clear that would be a bridge too far. Instead, they were married in the new schoolhouse they had built together in the rebuilt saloon's back room. The walls still smelled of fresh-cut pine. Half the town attended. The other half stayed away, their disapproval a silent, palpable thing that hung in the desert heat. But those who came brought gifts, food, their children, and the kind of rugged hope that can only grow in the most unlikely soil. Samuel Miller stood in the back, his face unreadable. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the old preacher didn't cheer with the others, but he didn't leave either. And later, when Jonathan looked back, seeking some sign of forgiveness or acceptance, Samuel met his gaze and nodded once. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition that his son had chosen his own path and would have to live with the consequences. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge that evening, Jonathan and Margaret Miller sat on the porch of their home, the rebuilt Broken Wheel. It now served coffee and education alongside the whiskey that kept the doors open. The future stretched before them, as uncertain as any frontier, but it was a future they would face together. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked, her head resting on his shoulder as the last light of day painted the sky in fiery colors. Jonathan pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, the lingering smell of wood smoke, and the sweet, wild perfume of the desert sage. "The only thing I regret," he said, his voice sure and clear, "is waiting so long to realize that sometimes salvation comes disguised as temptation." He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had seen him, truly seen him, from the very beginning. "And the only sin is being too afraid to recognize grace when it's standing right in front of you." If this story touched something in you, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. And if you believe, like I do, that the greatest adventures happen when we have the courage to choose love over fear, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one, waiting in the strange and shadowed corners of history. Stories of courage, passion, and the eternal human struggle to find our own kind of grace in an uncertain world.